Morning, folks. It is June the 18th, and I indicated this morning to those of you who follow my vlogs that we were going to investigate the fact that the postmodern state involves itself in social engineering rather than maintaining the rule of law, and why this is, of course, a threat to liberty under law and an orderly society. It's a very, very dangerous idea. It's one that's been long in the making. I have an article here entitled "The Quiet Revolution: How the New Left Took Over the Democratic Party," written by Scott Powell, published August 23rd, 2015, in The American Thinker. And he has some fascinating insights, because it was already obvious long before 2015 that the creatures that inhabit the shells of the former creature, the Democratic Party or the Liberal Party of Canada, are no longer the same creature. Frustration with division and gridlock in Washington leads many Americans to impugn both political parties for the current broken and ineffective state of government. There is plenty of blame to go around, but below the surface there has been a quiet revolution going on in only one of the two parties, the Democratic Party, which is the main source of today's irreconcilable division and moral confusion. What's remarkable is how the political and cultural center of American values has collapsed in the last 2.5 decades, with the Democratic Party having moved dramatically to the left. Recently, Democratic National Chair Debbie Wasserman Schultz could not explain the difference between the modern Democratic Party platform and that of socialism, while at the same time gushing over the prospect of socialist Bernie Sanders having a prominent place at the 2016 Democratic Party convention. If people today could somehow be transported back to the time of Harry Truman and Jack Kennedy, they would swear those standard bearers were Republicans with little in common with today's Democratic Party. Hence me saying that they're like hermit crabs. The creature inhabiting the shell is not at all like the former creature. America's two political parties have always been fundamentally different. The Republican Party has been rooted in the moral principles and transcendent values expressed in the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. The Democratic Party acknowledges that the starting point of the country may have been the Declaration and the Constitution, but since Woodrow Wilson, many Democratic Party leaders have contended that progress requires constant adaptation, changing morals, and liberal interpretations of law and history. The progressive philosophy that the Democratic Party has come to embrace now has its roots less in values of life, liberty, and pursuit of individual happiness, and more in the tenets of race and class identity, equal outcomes, and expanding the welfare state. Since individuals vary in talent, ability, and motivation, and the free market system produces unequal outcomes of success, a core principle of the Democratic Party is now redressing this disparity through the redistribution of wealth. The strongest critic of early industrial capitalism came from the German philosopher Karl Marx, who believed that the contradictory forces of labor and capital inevitably bring about class struggle. Of course, Marx was wrong. The proletariat did not rise up against the bourgeoisie. I'll cut a little to the chase here and get to the real source of the modern consternation. And of course, it begins with what I had mentioned in my post, social engineering. In the 1930s, the Frankfurt School in Germany, knew that Marx had got it wrong with regard to the proletariat rising up against the bourgeoisie. So they exchanged class struggle for the struggle of the dominant patriarchy over all the oppressed classes, particularly if you happen to be intersectionally oppressed. One of the leading philosophers, if that's what you want to call him, I would prefer to call him an ideologue, was a fellow by the name of Antonio Gramsci. He had emerged as a leading Marxist theoretician in Italy, and he founded the Italian Communist Party in 1921. After being imprisoned by Mussolini, the fascist Prime Minister of Italy, Gramsci authored what came to be called prison notebooks, partially published in 1947 and in complete form in 1975, a legacy that made him one of the most important Marxist thinkers of the 20th century. Gramsci argued that communists' route to taking power in developed industrialized societies such as Europe and the United States would best be achieved through a long march through its institutions, which is why our universities and now our government have become entirely corrupted. And I would add to that, of course, the bureaucracy. This would be a gradual process of radicalization of the cultural institutions, the superstructure of bourgeois society, a process that would in turn transform the values and morals of society. Gramsci believed that as society's morals were softened, its political and economic foundation would be more easily smashed and restructured. Cultural Marxism was also in vogue at the Institute of Social Research at the Frankfurt School in Germany, Frankfurt University. That is, until 1933, when the Nazis came to power. Many members of the Frankfurt School, such as Herbert Marcuse, Erich Fromm, Theodor Adorno, Max Horkheimer, Wilhelm Reich, fled to the United States, where they ultimately found their way into professorships at the various elite institutions, such as Berkeley, Columbia, and Princeton. In the context of American culture, the long march through the institutions meant, in the words of Herbert Marcuse, working against the established institutions while working in them. And these same fellows got involved with Wild Bill Donovan and helped found the CIA, or the precursor organization that became the CIA. So even the CIA became heavily under the influence of cultural Marxist social engineering ideas. While under the influence of Marcuse and the Frankfurt School, a Marxist like Gramsci was greatest in intellectual circles in the strategic sense, Saul Alinsky arrived on the scene in Chicago in the 1930s with the tactical tools for foot soldiers of social and political revolution, the community organizers, and non-academic labor and single-issue activists. Olenskis had a certain charm and appeal to wealthy funders and had no trouble raising considerable sums to establish the industrial area's foundation in Chicago, from department store mogul Marshall Field and Sears Roebuck heiress Adela Rosenwald Levy, as well as Gardner Howland Shaw, an assistant secretary of state in Franklin Roosevelt's administration. I'm going to read Olenskis Rules for Radicals. Power is not only what you have, but what the enemy thinks you have. Never go outside the expertise of your people. Whenever possible, go outside the expertise of the enemy. Make the enemy live up to his own book of rules. Ridicule is man's most potent weapon. A good tactic is one your people enjoy. A tactic that drags on too long becomes a drag. Keep the pressure on. The threat is usually more terrifying than the thing itself. The major premise for tactics is the development of operations that will maintain a constant pressure upon the opposition. If you push a negative hard and deep enough, it will break through into its counterside. The price of a successful attack is a constructive alternative. Pick the target, freeze it, personalize it, and polarize it. You see, these ideas are thoroughly entrenched in our political class. In the Democratic Party in the States, in the Liberal Party of Canada, of course in the NDP, and the Green Party, but now, even more importantly to this discussion, members of the Conservative Party of Canada have become thoroughly infected with this cultural Marxist nonsense. The sole function of government is to maintain the rule of law, to maintain law and order. The government has no right to interfere in society. Society has the right to dictate to the government what it shall be. Social engineering is not a function of limited constitutional government, either in the US, in Canada, or throughout Europe. This first came to my attention in 2013-2014 when I was living in Norway. I became appalled at how willing the government there was to engineer every cloying aspect of human life. And they would create a problem, and then they would emerge as the only ones that could solve it. There wasn't a single aspect of human existence that they didn't try to control. And you never knew exactly what the rules were. The borders were always changing. The goalposts were always moving. Excuse me. And this is exactly what we're seeing here now. The rules for COVID change all the time. Let's call it the CCP virus, because that's what it is. And now that CBC has admitted that we sent deadly viruses to Wuhan, and that's why, in contradiction to what the RCMP said, that's why the scientists that were working out of China at our laboratory in Winnipeg were arrested and detained. There's no extreme that our government won't involve itself into, including Trudeau's failed attempt at winning a seat on the UN Security Council. And irony of all ironies, who won it? Yes, the Prime Minister of Norway, the Stats Minister of Norway. If you knew what was going on behind the scenes, all this stuff makes sense. We need to rid ourselves of a political class who's trying to restructure our heads to conform to their cultural Marxist ideals. And they could have never gotten into power if it wasn't for the fact that you and me accepted what they were doing and voted them into office. It's time for us to wake up and realize that this is nothing but a cultural takedown, and that the very cradle in which our society rests, the rule of English common law, and the blindness of Lady Justice and weighing all people by the same weight of scales, is being torn apart, undone. In the name of equity, there can be no equal treatment without being equal before the law. You fools need to wake up. This is a do or die situation. This current crisis and the shutdown of the economy And the fact that other nations have dealt with it differently, such as Sweden, and haven't suffered the negative consequences it was predicted by the so-called experts, is proof everything that we're seeing today is an attempt to shut down the liberal free market, individual liberty-based West. The greatest notion that ever emerged in the Western world was the idea of the sovereign person accountable for their actions, endowed with inherent rights, created in the image of God, responsible to Him for their behavior. Be responsible and vote responsibly. This government has got to go, and you need to be writing your MPs and tell them that you're not going to have any more social engineering out of them, that their only job is to maintain the rule of law. I hope you're having as angry a day as I am, because I'm fed up with everything I see in the nation's capital. Have a great day.